Hi everybody, welcome to this episode of Azure On Air podcast. We're at the Integrate Summit and I'm joined by Julia Casper, who's from the API management team. So really pleased to get the chance to speak to you, Julia, because you're a specialist in the API Center area. And for me, it's something I know about, but I haven't really had the chance to play with it much. So it's a good opportunity for me to sort of learn about some of the investments your teams make and kind of really learn about why I really want to add this to my architecture. So thank you for joining us. Can you just tell me a little bit about your history at Microsoft and kind of your background, please?
Yeah, definitely. Lovely to be here. So I actually joined Microsoft 4 years ago. As you can probably tell by my accent, I started out as a Microsoft consultant in Germany.
Right.
So I lived in Germany for 2 years. And then over 2 years, I really, I caught a fire because I wanted to be working closer with product. So that's when I made the switch from a role perspective, but also a relocation. So I actually moved to the US. So I'm now based in Redmond. And I started out as a end-to-end PM or product manager, which is more like, you're looking from products from an end-to-end perspective. So what are some very typical customer journeys, how they are using some of the products we have. So I started out in the developer division. I've always had a strong interest in dev tooling and
so just stuff, on that, when you say end-to-end, what does that really mean?
You know how it is that at Microsoft, we have our specific product focus, but the reality is customers are not just using one. Most of the time they're actually using products because they are integrating it with other things. So it's actually very important to look at these products from an end-to-end, like from a user journey perspective. It's like, I want to build out my web API, but I'm starting in my IDE and then I'm deploying it to Azure, and what is the journey? And it's actually covering multiple different products, right? So here the idea was we want to make the end-to-end journey as smooth as possible for our developers, who are in this case my customers, or like the lens I was having. So
I guess that's a really important kind of mindset, I guess, to bring to the product team, isn't it? Because I know at previous Integrate Summits, it's always really obvious that people from the product team who've been very focused on just one product versus bringing the kind of breadth of experience of other projects. And for us as integration people, that's something we do as our day job kind of thing. So it's great to see that's your background. So have you always been, since you went product focused, have you always been API management team, or have you worked on other teams previously?
So as an end-to-end PM, I was always part of the Microsoft API management organization. So that's when I first touched. I've also had previous experience with API management, but that's where I started to really work closely with the API management team. And 2 years ago, they started the project within the API management organization of Azure API Center. Back then, it was actually called API Catalog, because that's essentially what the idea is. And it originates from the use cases that a lot of the customers out there, most likely, they don't necessarily just have one APIM instance. They actually have 1, 2, some of them even have 20. Like, we've talked to customers who have so many API management instances up and running. And then also a lot of our customers, they are cross-cloud. So it's not just as much as we would hope. It's not just always Azure, So it's actually more. And so they detected this problem or this challenge across customers where they had a lot of different instances up. They, like services, they also had different types where they deployed the APIs, and like APIs were just growing everywhere, and it started kind of to sprawl. Like API sprawl is definitely a challenge.
What are some of the scenarios that you think lead a customer to have multiple API management instances? So I've worked at a couple of customers before where we had a very centralized API management practice, but then I have seen customers where they have multiple. What's your experience of the driver for that?
There are definitely multiple different customer scenarios I would call out. As much as we would hope that they ideally only have one because they should be centralizing all of this, the reality is I've seen scenarios where they are spinning up different APIM instances based on regions. So I've seen customers deploying one in Europe or in North America. Then I've also seen a very typical setup is dev, test, prod. So they have their API development pipeline, and they are only granting like API developers, sometimes even citizen developers, access to the APIM dev instance, so they can play around, they can get the first APIs in, and as soon as it's ready for testing, that's when they are moving or shifting to test. And then at some point they are moving it to production. So that's another scenario. Another one is they want to separate it not just based on region, but also based on teams. So for example, just a very basic example here, but I only want to have marketing APIs in one APIM or only HR APIs. So these, I think, are the most typical scenarios.
Is that really like when you see that team-based or product-based scenario, is that because teams don't want to interfere with what each other are doing? Do you think that's a common thing? Or, I'm frightened that I deploy my API and it breaks your API kind of scenario?
Yeah, I think definitely a little bit of, that these are ours, we want to be in charge of them. Sometimes it's also based on security rules or certain things that they only want to see within this APIM instance. Which ideally, of course, if you want to centralize it, I think we should, like from a product perspective now, but we should have the features or capabilities in place to even displace these scenarios that customers have. So
my understanding from how you've described API Center so far is that, so I've got, my organization has, let's say, 10 API management namespaces, different environments, different products, etc. But I think you said you could also have a third-party product.
Correct,
so let's say I've got an Apogee. I guess a great scenario is going to be that huge enterprise customer. I've worked with a few of them where you've even got different businesses as part of a conglomerate around the world. You may have different businesses have different API products. Let's say somebody's got Apogee, somebody's got Kong or something like that. So I think you're saying API Center really sits holistically above them, and you can kind of visualize what you've got deployed out. Is that kind of really where you're coming from?
Yeah, correct. So one of the first use case, or one of the use case scenarios we've heard is, my CTO or like whoever has asked us, what are all of the APIs that we have out there? But they currently don't have a tool where they can actually just show them a table or show them an inventory and say, these are all the APIs that we have out there for multiple different problems. Like, yes, sometimes they are managed, at least of them. Sometimes they're even like shadow API discovery is also a huge challenge, right? But essentially the problem was that we wanted to solve is, here's your inventory of APIs that you have within your organization. And here's it's a list of all of the APIs that you have, and you have the transparency into it.
So you mentioned something there about sort of shadow APIs and discovery. So I guess I know a little bit about some of the data catalog things on Azure a few years ago. I must admit it's not something I've really looked at for a while, and I'm not sure if maybe Purview kind of supersedes that or something. But I guess is the idea that API Center can go discovering APIs that you might have that you don't necessarily know are there. Is that kind of where you're going as well?
That's definitely the North Star vision. We are not there yet. I mean, we just went to GA last month. So right now we are in inventory, and we are an inventory of the APIs that most likely you know of, because you have to register them, you have to bring them in. And at some point, the idea is, it would be so cool if you just can click a scanning button and it shows you, here are the probably a lot of APIs that you didn't even were aware of. So this semester, just to talk a little bit about features or things that we are working on, is a focus on GitHub. We have the hypothesis of, CI/CD pipelines, it's the best practice. So most likely somebody has deployed their source code or logged their source codes into GitHub. So that's where you can, as a starting point, start searching for these APIs.
Right.
So that's like the first step, just because we are already targeting with the inventory aspect the Azure area, and most likely or hopefully you have a little bit better transparency into some of the APIs that you have deployed there. But what about source code, which is more likely you're just going to
So you're really thinking about the life cycle of an API, I guess, where it's like, we've got it deployed and we can find it, but actually can we trace it back through? Where's the code for that API? How does it get deployed in sort of the full life cycle? Is that really what you're
correct?
That's really cool.
So we do have a Visual Studio Code extension, just because we really wanted to make it as integrated with the dev pipeline. especially, so we've interviewed a bunch of API developers and we were like, well, what are some of the challenges or some of the things that you either hate or are challenging for you? And one of the things was, yeah, my API admins, they are always asking me to register it then into like whatever tool that they want or check on certain rules or guidelines. So we actually want to shift more left and include them as soon as possible. So that's why we started out having these developer tool support for our product early on, so they can either easily or quickly register it via the extension, via their CI/CD pipeline, and then do some other fun stuff there too.
If I imagine a scenario where I'm a developer in an organization, so let's imagine there's a new project spins up, I've got to build an app that does some stuff. And I know that my organization might have APIs already. How would API Center help me start that project? I guess the discovery kind of mechanism, I think, is really where I'm thinking about. Is that one of the use cases that you think as well?
Yeah, so I think definitely one of the use cases is, okay, I'm starting out, I have a goal in mind. One of the first things is we've seen across these organizations, a lot of the developers don't even know if this API has already been built. So the idea is, okay, I'm already in Visual Studio Code. Before I'm even starting the project, let's check out API Center and see what are some of the APIs that's already there. So they can go in, they can check out, they can see some documentation, they can see some of the endpoints, which is most likely where they can find some of the use cases that they have been built for. But then so there are two scenarios. Either they find the API, which is great, then they can already use it, or they're going to get started with building out a new API. And while building this API out, ideally, they already registered the API in a different lifecycle stage. So we have lifecycle stages within API Center as well, and just register it. Or they're going to wait until it's production or whatever pipelines the organization also has in place. They can then register.
Do you when I hear the plans, that really sounds to me that API Center has really taken my Azure APIs to the next level about making it so, all these companies want to get to be an API-enabled organization, and they view that as being really pivotal to them being successful moving forward. And I feel like API Center is a really good move from Microsoft to help get customers to that next level. Is that really what you feel about or where you want API Center to be?
Yeah, so I definitely, as I mentioned, APIs, first of all, where APIs are being deployed, there are so many different services. The other thing is, and especially with the AI wave, APIs are just growing and growing. And I think we've seen this trend a couple of years now. So having an API first strategy, and especially talking to customers who've already adopted to an API first strategy, they actually shifted fast and they are more innovative. So the goal is with API Center to actually bring an API first strategy to these companies and make it a little bit more integrated in how they think APIs, how they build APIs. And that's why we also wanted to include the developers, because there are a lot of challenges, just like guidelines or rules as well that they have to follow.
So what do you think then about, if we touch on developers again, I guess one thing people might have a slight confusion about is I've got the API developer portal, but then I've got API centers. What's the difference between those two moving forward?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, API management is definitely a more evolved product at this point. So if your core, there are different use cases. So one is API management is for external developers and internal developers. Right now, API Center definitely has to focus on internal developers. So that's one of the biggest differentiator. The other one is, it's definitely more advanced API management. They have the dev portal, they have a way to set it up to even customize it a little bit and better. API Center currently comes with the option of self-host your API Center. So we have data plane API that can expose whatever you have into your API Center. So you can essentially expose the data into a self-hosted API Center portal, or at some point, whatever kind of UI or whatever portal experience you're looking for. Long-term vision, and this is probably just like a personal approach to it, I would love, if you're telling the story of API Center is your one organizational hub where you can find your APIs, we should definitely have maybe the same or maybe even a more advanced cataloging or portal experience.
Yeah.
But that's the beauty of us working very closely with the APIM folks, so we can find a common ground, align with the strategy. It does take time to get the product ready, especially a portal is a lot of work. So that's why it kind of depends what the customer really is looking for. If they're just looking for a portal experience, I'd probably right now still point them in a way to API management. Or if they want to do the self-hosted route, which we've also seen a lot of customers, because self-hosting comes with so much flexibility, which means you can customize it, whatever the experience or whatever you want your portal to look like, that's what you can do. So yeah, that's.
So I think we've got about time for one more question. I think that the one I'd really like to ask you is, my feeling is, we're at a conference with about 300 people here and about another 300 online. I'm pretty sure a lot of people here may have heard of API Center, but maybe not tried it yet. So what would you say is the best way for people to get started, and what can they expect to get in terms of value for their first, attempt at trying out API Center? And what would you be hoping their takeaway would be?
So we have a free plan, so it doesn't cost anything. You can go into Azure, you can just spin it up and test it. I think the first scenario is pick a handful of APIs that you want to import. Use the different tools or services, how you can import these APIs and test it, depending on what works for you. So we have CLI, we have CI/CD support, we have biceps. So whatever kind of tool, whatever works with for your organization. So start to see what's the experience like for me to register these APIs. That's, I think, the first getting started. After this, I would recommend looking at API governance. So API Center has one feature called API analysis, which is around API design governance. Also a differentiator between APIM and API Center. We look at API design governance versus API management looks at API governance from a runtime perspective. So I think test this out. We have ACD up templates where you can quickly just get this imported, define some rules that you might seem fit for your organization, and just check this out. So you can kind of make a check mark on, registry or inventory, yes, API governance, and then either test out the Visual Studio Code extension, especially if you're thinking about exposing these APIs to internal developers. Or if you want like somewhat of a portal experience, again with an ACD up template, try out the portal, the self-hosted portal, to see some like the discovery experience and what it looks like and what might better fit.
So I guess my sort of final takeaway from this chat, I've really enjoyed this chat, by the way. It's good, especially kind of me knowing enough to ask, I hope, useful questions, but also being like a little bit behind the scene, or a little bit sort of not fully up to speed with API Center. It's been really insightful for me to get some of your thoughts on this, but I think the takeaway for integrated audience is really all the architects we've got here really need to try this out and start getting API Center as part of their API governance strategy to help their developers over the coming year build their Azure integration solutions. I think that's a good takeaway for everybody in the audience.
And please reach out for product feedback. I think that's the beauty of us just GAing last month is we are still a very young product. So there's lots of opportunities to shape also the product, which is exciting from a PM perspective, but also I think from a customer perspective, because we can really work with some of our big customers, which we already are, to finding a great fit, getting the customer feedback in. So
we have loads of Azure podcast type content, so we'd love to have you back to talk about future things about API Center, because I think it's really one of these core things our audience really cares about. So we'd love to have you back sometime.
Oh, definitely, yeah. And because we are moving so fast with like introducing new features, like even in half a year, so many things will probably have changed. So super excited. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the conference today.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks.